Hello and welcome to the Relax You're a Yoga Teacher podcast, the podcast that is designed to take the stress out of teaching yoga, because nobody got into teaching yoga because they wanted to be overworked, overwhelmed, stressed or burnt out. We all got into teaching yoga because we want to share the love of yoga. So we've got a really juicy topic today. We're going to be looking at how much should I charge for my yoga classes. So this is the same if you work for a studio, if you would do privates, if you are selling it directly to the customer. At some point somebody is going to say to you, how much do you charge? And you're going to have to answer that. And I think a lot of yoga teachers are very shy of looking at the nuts and the bolts of their business. And I think the reason for this is because we're supposed to just do it for the love. So it seems really un-yogic to put a price on something that we enjoy. It seems really un-yogic to put a price on yoga. But at the end of the day, we have bills to pay. When we can live rent-free and we can go to Tesco and we can buy our food with yoga, we are going to have to put a price on it, and we're going to have to get paid for teaching yoga, because teaching yoga is a valuable job. It's a valuable career. We make real changes in people's lives, and nobody wants to be taught yoga by somebody who is stressed about money. You don't want to be taught yoga by somebody who is scrabbling about, unable to do their own yoga because they're so financially burdened. You want to be taught yoga by somebody who has the space in their lives to be able to practice the yoga. So we need to charge what we need to charge in order to be able to have the kind of life where we can have the space to do our own yoga. So don't ever feel guilty for taking money for doing yoga, because it's an energy exchange. You've trained hard, you have put the years in, the effort in, the work in, and somebody is paying you for a service in exactly the same way that you would pay for your hair to be cut, or you would pay for your eyebrows to be waxed, or you would pay for somebody to come and paint your house. It's a skill that you have learned and you need to be paid for it. You need to be able to live your life. And I think that this kind of icky feeling around money means that a lot of people are worried to put on their sensible glasses and look at the numbers in their business. And this is a really weird one, because I think it's a lot of the time it's people who are usually very sensible in other parts of their lives. And also it's something that if you were to say to somebody, how would you set your prices? It's actually very obvious advice that I'm going to give you, but just because it's obvious advice doesn't mean that you actually do, which with a lot of things with yoga, isn't that just the truth? That it's often obvious things that we just don't implement that makes the biggest difference. When you are thinking about how much to charge, the first thing you have to do is know how much it costs you to put on that class. So I think that when people are pricing their classes, quite often what they do is they just charge whatever everyone else is charging. So they just Google private yoga class and then just pick a number in the middle. But what you charge, what it costs you to put on the class, is going to be different depending on your circumstances. So there's going to be things like economy of scale. There's going to be things like how close you are to the business, how much you want to do it. Like there's so many different factors that come in. But the very first one is, how much is that class going to cost for you to put on. There is no point in paying someone else to teach them yoga. And that's essentially what you're doing when you underprice yourself. The other thing that people do is, and you're hearing this more and more and more in the like business world, where people are just saying charge as much as you can. So like charge the highest amount and then people will value it. Well, that's not going to work either, is it? Because if you charge just the highest amount you can, you have to be able to back that up with your service. And though we'll get into it a little bit more later, but pricing isn't the only factor in why someone will choose you. It definitely is a factor. So if you just say, right, I'm going to charge the highest amount, that's not going to work either. You need to sit down and work out your expenses and how much it's going to cost you to put on the class. The other thing that people do is they just Google their competitors and they just choose that as their price. Now, your competitors will have worked out, well, actually, some of them might not have done, but you would have hoped that your competitors will have been working for their budget. And they might have very high rent, they might have, a rich husband who can afford to supplement them. So you can never just guess your prices off what other people charge. You need to work out your own expenses, and people are terrible at this. Don't just guess how much things are. Like, sit down with a spreadsheet and include things like your music license, your training, your travel, but most importantly, pay yourself. Put that into your expenses. If you don't do that, later on, it's going to be really difficult to add it in, because if you don't pay yourself first in your business, you're going to have created a pricing model that doesn't factor in paying you. So it's going to be a big jump later on when you decide to pay yourself. So from the very first class, get used to you being paid from that class. If you can't pay yourself from that class with the pricing that you've put out, you need to change something in your business model. So you might have to, most obvious one, put the price up. You might have to have more people in the class. You might have to rebrand yourself so that you appeal to people who can afford a higher price. You might need to change where you do the class so your rent is low. If your expenses, if you can't pay yourself because your expenses are too high, where can you cut costs somewhere else? Like, this all needs to factor in. And the other thing that I personally wouldn't skimp on is things like accountants. So I got an accountant really early on, much earlier on than I could probably afford to have an accountant, and that's because I'm severely dyslexic. So if I hadn't have got an accountant really early on, I would have just spent my whole life doing accounts and being frightened of my accounts. Now I have a wonderful accountant, shout out to Julie Ralph. I just give her all of my stuff and she sorts it out. And it's quite a big expense in my business, but I wouldn't be able to run my business without it. Like, my yoga teaching wouldn't be able to happen without that. Now, you might be really great at expenses, at accountancy. That might not be a problem for you at all. If that's the case, woohoo! You can do your own accounts, but maybe there's something else that you need to be able to factor in. So maybe you're not very good at website design. You might not be very good at your social media. Everyone's going to have bits that they are not as confident in. Now, there's some things that you could learn. Like, I couldn't do website when I first started, and now I'm pretty confident doing website stuff. However, that took a really long time. The amount of hours, if I add up the amount of hours that I did learning how to do a website, I probably could have, I paid for it in just a different way. So if I had paid someone to do my website, it probably would have over the years cost the same as it cost for me to do it, because I then I didn't spend that time teaching. But I really enjoyed learning how to do my website, and because yoga teaching is my full-time job, that to me seemed like a good payoff. But if you are really rubbish at computers and you've got no interest in learning website, pay someone to do it. Put that in your expenses. Do that early on, because one of the things that I regret in my business life is that I didn't factor in paying other people to do classes like cover and things like that early enough on, because then it became a huge jump later on when I had to do it. So if you factor it in earlier on, even when you feel like you can't afford it, if you need to tweak your business model so that your business is sustainable for you, because if you're doing loads of things that you're not very good at or that you hate in your business, then it's going to very quickly become a not very nice experience to run your business. So think about that when you're putting in your pricing. The other thing that I do with my pricing as well is, I don't know if this is like official pricing advice, but I definitely factor in how much do I actually enjoy doing the thing. So something that I really don't enjoy, I know there's been times in my life when I have been asked to do something that I really don't enjoy doing, and I've said okay, but then I put like a really high price on it because that was the price that would get me out of bed to do it, and they've said yes, and I've been like, oh wow. If you've got something like, if you're working with a corporation or business or even a private client, don't forget you can ask them what their budget is as well. Like when it comes to pricing, you can say to somebody, what is your budget? And then you can work it out with that. But first of all, you have to work out your expenses, and then on top of that you have to work out how much do you want to get paid. Now this is going to be really like scary, because nobody wants to be seen as being greedy, but there is a number that when they've done studies around happiness and money, what they've found is that there is a number that if you go below, your happiness goes down a lot. But if you go above it, it doesn't actually matter how much above it that you get. You don't get more happier the more you earn. But there is definitely a number where if you earn less than, it will very seriously affect your well-being and life, because nobody wants to live in poverty. So I think for most people that number is going to be different for everyone. So I spoke about this a little bit in the Success podcast, but the number that I can live on as a married woman with no children living in the northeast of England is going to be a completely different number to somebody with 3 kids living in London. So you need to work out what your number is. And you don't need to be a martyr. Like, you don't need to be a martyr. Like, if you know that having a really nice face cream is going to make you happy, and if you don't have it, then you're not going to be able to function. Or if you know that you need to go on holiday, if you know you need to have like bike maintenance or a golf club membership or whatever it is, I'm sure everybody has little things where they're like, if I don't have that, the quality of my life goes down. Factor it all in, so when you're working out how much to pay yourself, you're not designing a life that's awful. You're designing a life that is going to is nice. You're designing a nice life. And there's this thing about people say, well, if I put my prices really low, then more people will come to my classes. And that isn't true. It's not true. People do not go to yoga classes purely based on price. Well, some people do, but most people don't. Most people factor into when they decide what yoga class go to. They're factoring in how nice the class seems, how friendly the teacher is, how convenient it is. We're going to look at the 4 pillars of marketing in another episode, but it's much more complicated than just saying if I have cheap classes, then I will get more people. The other thing with that as well is that unfortunately we live in a society that really values money. So if you see a price and it feels too low, you think, well, what's wrong with that? So if somebody is offering you something and it seems too good to be true, people are much more likely to not value it as much. In my experience, if you put on a free class, people don't come because they think they don't value it as much. They're not investing in the experience. So some people think, oh, well, in that case, I'll just say, pay what you feel. Pay what you feel. And then it takes the responsibility of pricing off my shoulders. Don't do that. If you do pay what you feel, have suggested donations. But even that, people often find that really stressful. Now, I'm British. I'm from Newcastle upon Tyne. So when I'm speaking about culture, this is the culture that I'm talking about. But in Newcastle, in the UK, we are not good at talking about money or thinking about money. We do not want to haggle. We do not want to have that conversation. We just want to be told how much something is so we can pay it and move on. We don't have that bartering culture. We don't have that culture of the burden of the price being on the customer. Like, if somebody says, pay what you feel, it feels embarrassing because you're like, well, what if I get it wrong? It feels like a trick. They say, pay what you feel. Like, it's a trick. Like, am I going to look too cheap? So with donation-based classes, it's much better to have a sliding scale where you say, if you've got a job, then you pay this much. If you're a student, you pay this much. If you're unwaged, you pay this much. But I personally think that donation-based classes are not the best way to make classes accessible. I have said that, but I do sometimes do donation-based classes as a way to raise money for something. So for a charity. So I work quite closely with Mindful Therapies, and who do counselling. They do affordable counselling in the community, and if I do a donation-based class, it will be for them. So it's like a free class, but leave a donation to charity, and I'm not going to look at how much anyone's leaving. That's a nice to do, because I've already paid my bills and everything. That's just something extra that I do for fun. I don't live off the donations. And the other thing to factor in is making yoga financially accessible. So I 100% believe that we should make yoga financially accessible. However, I do not think that the way to do it is just by having free classes. You can build your business model in a way that, like I was just saying I do with Mindful Therapies, you build in more affordable options into it. So you could do like shorter YouTube videos, you could do one-off classes from time to time, you could work with a charity. I did a couple of ones with people with brain injuries, or you might, work with a refugee charity, or, there are ways to do that without just saying, I'm just going to put my classes on for free. Because what I find when you put on free classes, often the people who access the classes are not the people who need the classes. Access to yoga is more complicated than just finances. Obviously, finances are a big thing in it, but just by taking the financial barrier away doesn't necessarily mean that that class is now accessible. So a barrier might be being able to get there. So the class might be free, but how can people afford to get there? It might be a culture clash. So they might feel uncomfortable being in that particular part of town or walking into that space. They might not know what yoga is. Accessibility is so much more complicated than just saying, well, I'm going to make it free, therefore it is an accessible class. You're much better off working with people, with companies and charities and people who are already experts in creating accessibility within that community than just saying, I'm going to make a free class. Making a free class does not mean that your class is now accessible. And so make sure that you create a business model which is sustainable for you, so then you have the freedom to then do all of the good, do all of the things like making yoga accessible. And because you can't do that if you're burnt out, making yourself go into poverty isn't a virtuous move. You're not helping anyone if you're not helping anyone. So when you're pricing your classes, you need to factor all of that in. And what I would do, so the model that I use to price my classes is I work out my expenses. I then work out how many people I can put in the room. And then I just simply decide how much to charge based off per head with the expenses. And that's it. It's really, really simple. It's superly simple. But you have to actually look at it and do it. You can't just think you've done it. You have to sit down and work it out. You can't just say, oh, it feels about this much. You have to actually sit down and do it, and that's how you work out your pricing. If you have any questions about pricing, or if you want to go through it with anyone, do hit me up. I'm always happy to have a chat. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you for the next episode. Bye everyone.